I never actually planned on becoming a photographer per se. Photography was merely the medium that best enabled me to express my love of animals and the natural world. Initially, when I first started photographing, I wanted everything to be paradise-like, and so everything was very green and verdant. And then after 3 years of photographing, I discovered this place, Amboseli, which I fell in love with because at its most basic is an extraordinarily stark stage. That it's kind of like Irving Penn on his backdrop with nothing but your subject and a bare stage. And that's what these elephants and other animals on this lake bed under cloudy skies became for me, that it's just down to the most minimal essence of the animal. If I could have them on a stage with nothing around, this is the next best thing for me, except it's outside, so it's actually better because you've got this sometimes stunning cloudscape. Just as a portrait photographer would be drawn to the face or the personality of a specific person that they are compelled to take a portrait of and capture both the physical and the spiritual or whatever behind this extraordinary face, and the same with animals. So there were always certain animals that I got fixated on and felt compelled to try and capture their portrait, which would mean spending weeks with a specific lion and with a specific elephant until I hoped that I had captured the sense of that particular sentient creature. The initial body of work was a trilogy. On this earth, a shadow falls across the ravaged land. And between the second and third books, I'd been away for a year and a half, and when I came back to start work on the third book, Across the Ravaged Land, I discovered that many of the elephants that I had come to know had been killed by poachers, and it was happening on an almost weekly basis. Igor, the elephant from Elephant Drinking, was one of those elephants, and it was his killing that really motivated me to feel like I had to do more, that it was kind of irresponsible to just keep on portraying only beauty. I had to show more of the reality of what was happening. So it's reached the point where doing nature documentaries and pretending to the world that everything's fine and everything's an idyllic paradise, it's kind of bullshit. It's just, we can't continue to fool people into thinking everything's fine. It's not. There's 2 photographs that I do think kind of sum it up quite well. In the second book, there's a photo called Elephants Walking Through Grass, which is a line of elephants, and it's a vision of of plenitude, of a kind of paradise, of strength, a low-angle shot of this beautiful matriarch leading her herd across the plains. The following year, that matriarch, Mariana, was again killed by poachers. I did a deliberate echo of that image with a line of rangers that are employed by Big Life Foundation, the foundation that I co-founded, standing in a line with the tusks of elephants killed at the hands of man, so people can see, the kind of grim before and after. More and more, the real issue is the number of us. There are fewer and fewer places in Africa that is just untarnished wildlife habitat. Man is increasingly encroaching upon wildlife habitat, and it's happening at an extraordinary speed. That's what became the kind of natural progression going into this latest body of work, Inherit the Dust. It was less about the poachers and more about there's just too goddamn many of us. It's a world of environmental devastation out of control. And traveling around, I was always very aware of places that just a few years earlier had been filled with animals, with gazelles and impalas and zebras and giraffes, was now just emptied of them. And somehow along the way, a couple of years ago, I just came up with this idea of placing these life-size panels of the animals that I'd taken portraits of and placing them within the places that they used to roam, but no longer do. Whatever happens in the real world, for me, is always going to outdo what you can create in Photoshop or in your imagination via Photoshop. And that was borne out for me in the 4 months I spent shooting the series. Time after time, stuff would happen that I never would have thought of, that just took the concept of the photographs that much further. For me, one example is the photograph Underpass with Elephants, where I took a portrait of an elephant family and placed them under an underpass. Put in that context, hemmed in by these two giant pillars of an underpass, they look trapped. They don't know where to turn, where to go. The trunk of the elephant does actually look like it's resting on the real ground, not the ground in the photograph. And then added to that was the complete unexpected appearance of these homeless people who live there, and the kids are all, they're just high on glue. I mean, there is a really sad, tragic quality to how the people are in some of these photographs. I hope people get a sense from these photographs that it's not just the animals that are victims of the environmental devastation, it's also the human beings. In this particular instance, on Wasteland with Elephant, with this particularly stormy apocalyptic sky, it wasn't just about the clouds above the scene, it was the way the light transformed what was happening on the ground. So in other words, not all flat light is the same. Every flat light is different. Even though you don't quite think so, even though you can't quite figure out what it is or why it is, and the sun's way behind a whole bank of dense clouds, there is something that changes. And so in that particular photograph, that just worked in conjunction with the panel set in that location. The very weakness of some photographs became their strength in this context. So, for example, the photograph of the chimpanzee down the alleyway. That photograph was never used because the chimpanzee wasn't making a connection with me. He was just looking down. And I just thought, well, you know what, I've got better. There, in the context of that alleyway, it looks like he's looking down, lamenting the loss of the world which he once knew. Right from the very beginning, I was captivated. I've always been captivated by black and white photography. I didn't want a modern sensibility. I wanted the images to feel like they were from another time, when those animals that I'm photographing in the here and now effectively appear to be long gone. So there's more sense of this kind of melancholic elegy to that world. That wouldn't have worked in color. I think it would have been too much eye candy. It would have been too sentimental. Moving on into the new work, that also for me had to be black and white. The original photographs were taken in black and white, and I wanted those panels of the animals to blend into this modern day world. There is a indefinable, impossible to analyze something that happens upon occasion of the interaction between light and negative. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it has for me a certain mystery, an atmosphere that I don't see when I have attempted to shoot digital. Digital for me has been too perfect, too sterile, too commercial, too lacking in surprises. Obviously my life would be so much easier shooting digital, and the projects would be much less expensive, and the images always leave me stone cold. I'm always very touched and flattered when people say they're moved by a still image. I think you have to be very careful that it's not sentimentality that's affecting people. It's actually genuine emotion, sentiment, as opposed to sentimentality. I've never quite understood why, but people have always interpreted the portraits I've taken of animals as having a sadness and melancholy, which is fine by me because I've always seen these images as an elegy for a world that was vanishing. I know it sounds really corny, but each of us can be a small incremental cog in the wheel of planetary improvement, whether it's environmental or otherwise. So I'm always delighted when anybody will utilize whatever skills they have to just try and illuminate. And we just hope for the best that we're making some kind of difference.